Okay. I work for All Covered. We're a division of Konica Minolta, and All Covered is one of the largest MSPs nationwide for small to medium-sized businesses. I've been with the company for 24 years, and I'm on a national team where I help lead the direction of all things Mac, including writing our Mac standards and best practices, and serving as the highest escalation point for our customers' Mac problems. I consider myself a Mac support generalist, and I'm passionate about teaching others my techniques and methodologies. Today I'm going to walk you through a concept I learned while becoming a Scrum Master. But I'm curious, before we start, how many people here know what Scrum is? Raise your hand. Okay, handful. I think that it would be good to go through a couple of questions before we get started to give those of you that aren't familiar with Scrum some context, like what is Scrum and what is a Scrum team and a Scrum Master. I promise I'll keep this part of the presentation brief. Scrum is a framework. Think of Scrum as a set of clear, well-defined rules that enable a team of people to collaborate very efficiently, allowing them to complete complex work in a short amount of time that's broken into sprints. And a sprint is typically 1 to 4 weeks. The word scrum comes from the game of rugby. It's short for scrummage. And this is when the rugby team groups closely together with their head down, attempts to gain possession of the ball and move it down the field. And that's a good analogy because basically companies are using Scrum because it's a well-established method for getting a group of people together to put their head down and to get stuff done, aka moving the ball down the field. Scrum is not a process or a technique or a definitive method. And contrary to popular belief, Scrum is not a software development framework. Scrum can be used to develop software, and it's what a lot of people think of when they hear the word Scrum, but it's not an agile software development framework. Scrum can equally be used to get any type of complex work done. And Scrum defines several roles, including the product owner, and this is the individual that is accountable for defining the work that needs to be done, in what order it should be done, and to best achieve the goals at hand. Then you have the Scrum team, which consists of 3 to 9 people. And then you have the Scrum Master. And the Scrum Master is the team servant leader. He or she helps people inside and outside of the Scrum team understand Scrum theory, rules, and values. So that's as far as I'm going to go into Scrum. But I will say this. The group that I work in within my company, we started using Scrum a couple of years ago, and although it can be a pain in the butt sometimes, it's a rigid system, I can say with 100% certainty that we are getting far, far more work done using Scrum compared to the various methods that we were using before for juggling our workloads. So back to the concept that I learned about while becoming a Scrum Master. Although this concept has been around for a while, I had never heard of it, but it immediately piqued my interest because I saw the potential of this to be applied to Mac troubleshooting, which, to my knowledge, as far as I know, no one has done this before. And at the core, this concept is recognizing that everyone in this room has their own troubleshooting habitat. And by habitat, I mean the place you're most comfortable with, where your head naturally goes when you're trying to fix something. You see, we all have different levels of Mac support experience rooted in many different places in the past. Whether or not you're aware of it, these all have a profound influence on defining your troubleshooting habits and patterns. Once you've recognized what your troubleshooting habitat is, other viewpoints become clearer, and this really helps with figuring out where the best place to start when you tackle a new problem. So let's draw this concept out and define some general things. We'll start off by saying that any problem can be broken down into one of 4 types. We have simple problems, complicated problems, complex problems, and chaotic problems. And these are grouped by how we perceive the relationship between cause and effect. So we have these four types of problems represented by these four squares. And for the purpose of defining this further, let's call each of these squares a domain. So problems that fit in the simple domain are ones that have one straightforward solution. And the relationship between cause and effect is obvious. When you work through a problem in the simple domain, it has the steps of sense what the problem is, categorize what type of problem it is, and then respond to the categorization. A couple of real-life examples of Mac troubleshooting problems that I would consider simple are Mac Outlook isn't returning search results. So you Google it and you find a Microsoft support article that tells you how to fix this problem, and following the instructions in the support article fixes Outlook search. Another example of a problem that I would consider simple on the Mac side is BBEdit crashes when opened, and you determined that it was working fine up until a recent Mac OS update. You also determined that BBEdit is not up to date. It's not current. And by applying the latest BBEdit update, fixes the problem, and the crash no longer occurs. You could say that simple problems are fixed by applying best practice, where the same solution can be applied to the same problem in the future. Problems that fit in the complicated domain take more time to figure out because the solution is not obvious. The relationship between cause and effect is related, but it typically requires expert analysis to find that relationship. And working through a complicated problem has the steps of sense what the problem is, analyze the problem, and then respond to the analysis. Complicated problems sometimes have multiple solutions and typically require multiple experts to come up with an acceptable fix. A couple of real-life examples of Mac troubleshooting problems that I would consider complicated are a Mac user is having a problem with Quicken, where Quicken reports fail to export as CSV. The report will run and it looks fine on screen, but it doesn't save the CSV file. Several techs attempt to fix this by trying things like deleting preference files or Googling for answers, but nothing works. Someone even comes up with a workaround of copy and pasting into Excel, but the user isn't happy with that. So eventually, Intuit Tech Support is contacted, the developers of Quicken, and they've seen this before. It can happen when a report was based off of an older report from an older file format. And sure enough, recreating the report using from scratch allows Quicken to export correctly. Another example of a complicated problem is a Mac call comes in from a Mac user who can't print to one particular printer. The print jobs just stack up in the queue. However, other Mac users can print to that printer just fine. Removing the printer and adding it back in doesn't help, and neither does power cycling the printer. So the ticket's escalated to a level 2 engineer who tries to reset the printing system by control-clicking on the printer list and selecting the hidden Reset Printing System option. This doesn't help either, so the ticket is escalated to a level 3 engineer who looks at the logs in the console utility to view the CUPS error log within the CUPS folder within the var/log, and it's determined that the print jobs are being held for authentication. So that engineer next looks in the keychain access utility and finds an NTLM printer password stored for the printer and deletes it. And this ultimately does fix the problem because that NTLM password doesn't match the user's current Active Directory password. But another engineer overhears this solution, and they put in a request to have NTLM authentication removed from that printer and replaced with something Kerberos-based, thus preventing the problem from happening again and providing an overall solution to the problem. You could say that complicated problems are fixed by applying good practice, not best practice. And what I mean by that is there are multiple good solutions to this, to resolving a complicated problem, but none of them is always the best solution. Both simple and complicated problems take an ordered approach. So I'm going to label the right side of this grid ordered. Problems that fit in the complex domain are figured out via exploration, where you can't predict the outcome of your actions in advance. The relationship between cause and effect can only be seen in hindsight or retrospectively. And complex problems are solved as a result of safe-to-fail experiments. Working through a complex problem has the steps of probe the situation, sense the results, and then respond to the results. A classic example of this on the Mac side is a user named John Smith reports that their keyboard shortcuts have stopped working in Adobe Illustrator. So you try some simple fixes like rebooting the Mac, but they don't help. And next you log in with a different user account on that Mac. And you find that the keyboard shortcuts work just fine in Illustrator. This means the cause of the problem is likely something user-specific. And to work through this problem in the complex domain, you would next log back in as John Smith and then systematically pull files and folders out of the user home folder to see if the problem goes away. And if the problem doesn't go away, you would put the items back and try something else. And this sort of problem where something doesn't work in one user account but does work in another user account is frequently caused by a plist or a database file located within the home library folder. And 9 times out of 10, this is going to be within the home library preferences folder or the home library application support folder. So for this particular Adobe Illustrator issue, I would narrow down 3 potential folders that would be potentially causing this problem. They would be the home library application support Adobe 23 folder, the home library preferences Adobe Illustrator folder, and the home library preferences Adobe Illustrator 23 settings folder. These are all folders that contain Adobe Illustrator preferences. Now, my favorite method for temporarily pulling things out to see if the problem goes away and then putting them back is to move the items to the trash. And so you would first quit the problematic app, and then you would move the suspect file or folder to the trash and then relaunch the app to see if the problem goes away. And if the problem does go away, then in retrospect, you know that whatever's in the trash is causing the problem. But if the problem continues, you can easily put things back to where they were before you try something else. You just open the trash, and you secondary click on the item you move there, and you select the put back feature. And then you replace when prompted. Now, this method for putting things that are in the home library folder temporarily in the trash and then putting them back, it's not limited to just one file or folder. You could literally go into the home library preferences folder and select half the items in there, put them all in the trash, try to reproduce the problem, and then based on the results, you could put them all back all at the same time. The Finder doesn't limit the putback feature to one specific item. And then once you found a group of items that when you put them in the trash, the problem goes away, and then when you put them back, the problem returns, it's just a matter of narrowing things down using the same safe-to-fail experiment where you put some things in the trash and then put them back and narrow it down until you come up with the actual culprit. Eventually, you will find a plist or a database file that was causing the problem. Another example of a Mac troubleshooting problem that I would consider complex is your boss has a MacBook Pro that hangs with a spinning pinwheel for up to a minute at a time, and this happens intermittently a few times a week. Several other techs have unsuccessfully tried to fix this problem using both best practice and good practices, and you examine the Mac thoroughly and you make note of a few potential troublemakers. Your boss streams music through Spotify most of the time. The Mac has an antivirus app installed on it that no one else has, and it has an old USB 2.0 Ethernet adapter connected with a USB-C 3 adapter. So you start off by uninstalling the antivirus app because no one knows how it got installed in the first place. And then the Mac hanging reoccurs a few days later, so you know that wasn't the problem. So next you get permission from your boss to temporarily uninstall Spotify. And the problem returns that very same day, so you know that's not the problem. Then you ask your boss to try running on Wi-Fi for a while. And after a few days, the problem doesn't return, so you give it another week, and the problem doesn't return. So in hindsight, you can pretty much narrow down that it was that Ethernet adapter, you send your boss to the Apple Store and have them buy a new Thunderbolt to Ethernet adapter, and the problem never returns. You could say that complex problems are fixed by applying emergent practice, because the solution emerges in hindsight. Good and best practices don't apply here because we can't predict the effect those practices might have. Problems that fit in the chaotic domain don't have a discernible relationship between cause and effect. It's non-existent. Chaotic problems are short-lived, where the only goal is to stabilize the situation. Working a chaotic problem has the steps of act immediately to stabilize the problem, sense how that's going, and respond accordingly. The worst decision when working a chaotic problem is indecision. After a chaotic problem has been stabilized, it'll likely transition into one of the other domains, and that's where you'll answer questions like, why did this happen, and how do I prevent it from happening in the future? A real-life example of a Mac troubleshooting problem that I would consider chaotic is an iMac Pro user upgrades to Catalina, and after the reboot, the Mac hangs with a progress bar. The progress bar stays up for an hour, so the user decides to power the computer down, and when they do that, it will not turn back on, nothing but black screen. So you lay hands on the iMac Pro, and you want to reset the SMC, and because it has a T2 security chip, you unplug it from power, wait 15 seconds, plug it back into power, then wait another 5 seconds and turn it back on. And sure enough, this does bring the Mac back to life, but it doesn't see the internal drive. So you hold down the Command-R keys, and you continue holding them down, and eventually you get a spinning globe icon, and you boot into Internet recovery mode. It's at this point that the user lets you know that there is a critical project he's been working on that's on his desktop. And although Time Machine is turned on, he hasn't had his backup drive connected in over a month. So this data has never been backed up, and it doesn't exist anywhere else. And of course, there's a big business deal tomorrow that requires presenting this to a customer. So the path to stability in this case is getting that data, that critical data recovered, and then deal with figuring out how to get that iMac Pro working. So since you're booted in recovery mode, you try running disk utility. And first aid completes, but it reports problems that couldn't be fixed. And afterwards, the volume still doesn't show as a valid startup disk. So even though this Mac wasn't set, didn't have the Time Machine backup drive connected, you check anyway to see if recovery is an option. And sure enough, there is a local APFS snapshot that's showing as a valid restore point. And this local APFS snapshot was created automatically when the Catalina installer was run, great feature that Apple's added. So theoretically, you could do a full restore to an external USB volume, but it would take overnight to complete, and given the nature of this problem where other things aren't working right, it would likely fail. So instead, you reboot and hold the T key down to see if the Mac will start up into target disk mode. And luckily this works, and it brings up the Thunderbolt and USB symbols. So you connect that iMac Pro to a MacBook Pro using a Thunderbolt cable, Thunderbolt 3 cable, and target disk mode volumes do show on the MacBook, and you're able to use the Finder to copy the critical project data off, allowing it to be accessed and presented to the customer on time. Now keep in mind, if you have a Mac that's been upgraded to Catalina and you boot it into target disk mode, it's going to mount two volumes. It's going to mount the read-only system volume and the read-write data volume. So in this case, you would go to the one that says data. Like if the drive name was Macintosh HD, you would get Macintosh HD, Macintosh HD data, and on data is where you would find the user's information to copy. So now that this problem has been stabilized, rebuilding the iMac is still something that needs to be done, but it's something that can be done using either good or best practices. So chaotic problems are solved using novel practices, where often you come up with new or original ways to stabilize the situation. And both complex and chaotic, but they both take an unordered approach. So I'm going to label the left side of this grid unordered. And when you approach a new problem and you haven't decided whether to take an unordered or ordered approach to fix it, you're in the state of disorder. So I'm going to add that here to the middle of the grid. Disorder is the nebulous place that all new problems start before you pick a direction on how to fix it. And before I move on, I'm going to take this grid that I put together here, and I'm going to make it look less grid-like by curving the boundaries that separate the domains. And I'm doing this to help illustrate that problems can be passed easily from one domain to another with little difficulty. But there is one exception to that, and that's the boundary between simple and chaotic. So I'm going to add a little hook here at the bottom to represent a cliff. When you work in the simple domain long enough, and you have applied the same simple, straightforward solution over and over again, it's easy to get caught in the compliancy zone. And the compliancy zone is the border between simple and chaotic. It's easy to fall off this cliff, but very difficult to climb back up. For example, a Mac user asks, why are they seeing 2 drives on their iMac? And you determine it's because their Fusion drive has gotten split. So you Google this, and you find an Apple support article titled, How to Fix a Split Fusion Drive. It looks very straightforward. All you have to do is run a one-line terminal command while rebooted into recovery mode. Simple, obvious, it comes from a reputable source. So you follow the steps blindly and overlook the warning that this permanently deletes all data. So you've fallen from the cliff from the simple to the chaotic domain, and in a matter of minutes, you've taken that Mac and rendered it useless and gotten rid of all the user's data. So this grid that I've put together here, this is the overall concept I found so interesting while I was introduced to it while becoming a Scrum Master. And it's called the Connivin Framework. Connivin is a Welsh word with a very Welsh pronunciation. Connivin. Everyone say it with me. Connivin. The CYN is not pronounced like cynic, and this word is not pronounced cynophant, which I hear a lot of people say. It's Connivin. Again, everyone say it with me. Connivin. Thank you. The silly way I learned to pronounce this is I envision the minion named Kevin whenever I see the word Connivin. And for some reason in my mind, associating Kevin with Connivin just seems to click with me. So that's how I tricked myself into remembering it. If you do a Google image search on Connivin, you'll find hundreds of examples of the grid that I just drew out. And they're all pretty much the same, although some swap out the word obvious for simple. Other than that, they're the same. Connivin is a purely conceptual framework. Doesn't cost anything, and it's not for sale. It's just a concept that can be used as an aid in the decision-making process. The Connivin Framework was created by Dave Snowden while working for IBM in the late 90s, around the same time that Apple had partnered with IBM and Motorola to create the PowerPC architecture and processor. In 2002, Dave was made director of IBM's Connivin Center for Organizational Complexity. And Dave Snowden is obviously Welsh, and Connivin is the Welsh word for habitat. Remember habitat? The place where you're most comfortable with, influenced by your past, that defines your approach to problem solving. Today, the Connivin Framework is commonly associated with agile software development, just like Scrum. But it's also widely used throughout the world in areas of science, healthcare, and military. After 9/11, the U.S. Defense Department and the Department of Homeland Security began using the Connivin Framework for counterterrorism decisions. I, for one, had never heard of Connivin Framework, let alone how to pronounce it. And I think the reason for that is no one has ever taken the Connivin Framework and applied it to IT troubleshooting, let alone Mac troubleshooting. But when I learned about it, something really clicked with me, and I'm going to share that with you now. You see, the Connivin Framework offers a sense of place from which to view your perceptions. I use it to help me recognize my own troubleshooting habitat and to see other viewpoints as part of my process. And most importantly, avoid using the same troubleshooting approach over and over again out of habit. I'm betting everyone in this room already has a preference towards one of these 4 domains. It's where you feel most comfortable with, and you may tend to slot problems in that domain that don't belong there. I've found that Mac techs who have roles that require them to create or follow process, like help desk staff or Jamf administrators, typically feel most comfortable in the simple domain. And don't get me wrong, I'm not belittling those that live and breathe process. I was once there myself. And Dave Snowden states that as knowledge increases, it has a clockwise drive from chaotic through complex through complicated to simple. The most knowledge resides in the simple domain. Process-oriented people tend to view failure as a failure of the process itself. They will unnecessarily keep problems in the simple domain in an attempt to find an obvious solution, which isn't always possible. I find that Mac engineers who are considered a subject matter expert in their field, they typically feel most comfortable in the complicated domain. And they will tend to view failure as a failure of not being given enough time or resources to do proper analysis. Unnecessarily keep problems in the complicated domain, thinking that more time and more analysis will give a solution, where oftentimes that isn't the case. And then you have techs like myself who've been doing Mac support for a very long time and have worn dozens of hats along the way. I think us more seasoned Mac support engineers feel most comfortable in the complex domain. I certainly do. I've gotten really proficient with using safe-to-fail experiments with narrowing down and fixing Mac problems. The complex approach will fix most problems, but it comes at the cost of taking more time. I don't have a good theory on what type of Mac tech naturally gravitates to the chaotic domain, but they do exist, and I've worked alongside many of them. They typically go at a very go, 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 do pace, and they are constantly acting without categorizing or analyzing what they're trying to fix. In summary, this is a decision-making framework. It doesn't provide solutions to problems, but it does help you figure out how to best approach them. If the potential of this concept piques your interest like it did mine, I would encourage you to print out a Connivin Framework grid, either one from the slide deck, my slide deck, or any of the ones you can easily find online, and place the printout somewhere at work. And as you go about your day, begin identifying what domain you're working out of. Then ask, does this problem best fit this domain, or am I troubleshooting it this way because this is how I feel most comfortable? And the next step is to ask those questions before you start working a problem. And the viewpoint that will result is typically the best domain it should be in. As I mentioned before, my troubleshooting habitat is in the complex domain because that's where I feel most comfortable with. I'm good at reverse engineering things, and I don't like asking other people for help, especially vendors, Adobe, Microsoft, Apple. And I've been known to spend hours experimenting to come up with a solution, only later to see the same problem posted in one of the Mac admin Slack channels where several experts give a very clear solution to it that I hadn't thought of, or even to have someone from our help desk show me a much simpler solution that they've already implemented as best practice. The Connivin Framework has pushed me to see other viewpoints clearer. And now I'm frequently working out of the simple or complicated domains. And I wish I'd been doing this a long time ago. I've also introduced this concept to other members on my Scrum team, and they're finding it very applicable to other areas of IT support. And my goal was to soon make training on the Connivin Framework available to the hundreds of engineers that work for my company, whether or not they support Macs. Now, I know the Connivin Framework doesn't reinvent the wheel. It basically just breaks down different problems and it bundles them with a lot of common sense. But its simplicity is what makes Connivin unique. Simply defining everything the way it does provides a mechanism for recognizing our habits. And this challenges us to avoid using the same approach over and over again. This benefits the decision-making process when you actually do apply a different viewpoint to a problem. To wrap up my session, I want to switch back to my troubleshooting habitat, the complex domain, and share one of my favorite techniques for narrowing down and fixing Mac problems, including a unique spin that I've put on it. Now remember, you use safe-to-fail experiments in the complex zone, which means you're going to continue trying different things until the problem is fixed. And most Mac problems can be fixed in this domain, but they take more time. The technique I'm going to share with you, I call it my shift-down technique, because we're going to be using the shift key to help narrow down the cause of a problem. Now, I'm assuming everyone in this room knows that you hold the shift key down to boot it into safe boot mode on a Mac. And you may or may not know that you hold the shift key down at login to disable the user login items. So to perform a safe boot, you hold down the shift key and you turn the computer on, or you hold down the shift key immediately after rebooting it, and you continue holding the shift key down until you get the apple with the progress bar. At that point, you can let go of the shift key. You'll know that you're booting into safe boot mode because this takes considerably longer than a normal boot, and when you get to the login window, it'll actually say safe boot in red text up in the top right of the display. So when you start your Mac in safe boot mode, FSCK is automatically run on the boot volume, and it attempts to repair any directory problems that it finds. FSCK is the command line tool inherited from the Unix world that stands for File System Consistency Check, and these days FSCK is actually a wrapper for FSCK_HFS or FSCK_APFS, depending on the volume format. Having FSCK automatically run is the equivalent of booting into recovery mode and going to disk utility and doing a first aid. And this is why it takes so much longer to boot into recovery mode, because when you see the apple with the progress bar, it's running FSCK. Now, since Mojave's release, I'm finding that doing a safe boot is taking much longer than it used to. Oftentimes 5 minutes or more, even on a Mac with an SSD. And I'll get more into this, why that's happening here in a bit, but just be aware that automatically running of FSCK may take some time. Performing a safe boot also deletes some troublesome cache files, specifically the user font cache, the kernel cache, and some system cache files. So one safe-to-fail experiment that I frequently do is I walk the user through doing a safe boot and then immediately doing a reboot. The user doesn't even have to log in. They can just hit reboot at the login window. And if doing a safe boot followed immediately by a normal boot fixes a problem, then I know in hindsight it was either caused by a directory being out of whack that was repaired by FSCK or the cache files that were deleted. And walking a user through doing a safe boot is something really simple to do, and it's easy, and it fixes all sorts of weird things. For example, here's a post last week from a Mac admin Slack channel that reports that doing a safe boot followed by a reboot fixes a problem with the mail app where autocomplete of emails were running slow. I've also figured out how to automate this sequence by setting the -x NVRAM boot argument, then rebooting the Mac, then removing the boot argument, and then rebooting it again. So that basically takes a Mac, boots it in a safe boot, lets it come up, and then reboots it without safe boot. I call this my ultimate safe boot dance script. And I wrote this script to tie in with another script that I wrote that does a live verification on the boot volume proactively by doing a diskutil verify volume. So this writes to a text file, or I've set it to write to a text file, and then I parse the text file to see if there are directory problems. And if there are directory problems, then I alert one of our engineers that they need to run my ultimate safe boot dance, and then verify by booting the machine back up and going into disk utility to do a live verification that the problem was actually fixed. And over the years, this has saved countless hours of time. While you're in safe boot mode, these things are disabled. Third-party kernel extensions, everything in the library extensions folder. Third-party launch daemons, everything in the library launch daemons folder. Third-party launch agents, everything in the library launch agents folder and the home library launch agents folder. And user login items, anything that's set in the users and group system preference pane as a login item for the user it's logging in. So if a problem goes away while you're booted into safe boot mode, but it returns when you're booted normally, then there's a very good chance it was caused by one of these things that was disabled. So it's just a matter of trial and error to figure out what the culprit is. Now, it should be noted that a handful of problems just can't be reproduced in safe boot mode because of all these things that are disabled. So for example, when you're in safe boot mode, you might not be able to capture audio or video to an external peripheral, and Apple's video acceleration is disabled on most Mac models when you're in safe boot mode, so the screen's a little glitchy and you can't do things like play a DVD. But I haven't run across these issues very often. Typically, if I'm experiencing a problem, I can at least go through the actions of trying to reproduce it in safe boot mode. Now, you can quickly eliminate one of these culprits, the user login items, by applying my other shift down technique. So that is, to disable the user login items, you boot the Mac up normally, and then you enter the user's credentials at the login window. But the trick here is to hold the shift key down when you click the arrow or when you click return to log in. If you're holding the shift key down at login, it disables the login items for that user. Now, if you've eliminated login items from the culprit and the problem still goes away in safe boot but returns in normal boot, then you need to narrow down which of these other 3 items is the culprit. And I have a great tip for potentially speeding this up. Simply rename the folders one at a time and then reboot and try to reproduce your problem. So take the library extensions folder here. Rename it anything. I like putting my initials to the end of the folder name. That way, if I forget to rename it back to extensions later and I see it, I know it was my fault that I did it. So now that, let's see. Oh, and you don't have to be logged in as an admin user. I'm sorry, you do have to be logged in as an admin user to do this. But nothing else prevents you from renaming these folders. This does work in I tried it out, and the Mac OS ignores them. It doesn't recreate them at reboot. So if you rename extensions and reboot, it's not going to make a new extensions folder. It just simply ignores it. So now that you've renamed the extensions folder, reboot and try to reproduce your problem. If the problem continues, then you know it wasn't anything in that folder, so you would want to name it back to extensions, and then go to the next one, launch daemons, and rename that one and reboot. And you would want to continue using this method until you find the folder that contains the items causing the problem. Now, I'm glossing over some very common sense stuff here. Like if one of these folders is empty, there's no need to rename it and reboot. And theoretically, the last one, the home library launch agents folder, you don't have to reboot for that. You could log out and log back in. But for that matter, you could use the terminal to load and unload these things. But for simplicity's sake, I teach this as the rename and reboot. So once you identify the folder that contains the item that's causing the problem, then you rename that folder back to where it was, and then you use the process of elimination to narrow down which item inside of it is causing the issue. And you do that by pulling things out one at a time or in bulk, and you'll have to reboot with each of these tests, but you'll eventually narrow down the cause of the problem in hindsight. Now for a few pieces of additional information I should mention. If a Mac has a lot of local APFS snapshots, it really slows down safe boot, because as FSCK is automatically run, Apple's decided that it should check each of the APFS snapshots. And I don't know what checking means, but I'm assuming it's, I really don't know what it means, honestly. But I can tell you it takes a long time. And this is why we've been seeing longer safe boot times since Mojave was released, because we're seeing more of these local APFS snapshots. I've personally not seen this exceed 10 minutes, 5 minutes or less is the norm for me. But Howard Oakley reported to the Eclectic Light blog a few days ago that he experienced a 30-minute safe boot time. Now, I read his blog post, and I think his was an extreme case because he had a Mac that had a lot of RAID storage, and he said in his post he had a couple dozen APFS local snapshots, so he has more than normal would. But it's worth noting that safe boot mode now takes longer. Apple mysteriously doesn't log what Safe Boot's FSCK is doing. So you can't go back later and look at a log to see if it fixed directory problems. I don't know why. The Safe Boot process is logged leading up to running FSCK and logged after running FSCK, but the unified log is completely blank while FSCK is being run. And currently, when you boot a Mac running Catalina in Safe Boot mode, FSCK is only run on the data volume. And isn't run on the data volume. It is run on the read-only system volume, but if you look in the logs afterwards, it states, attempts to check the data volume resulted in an error because the volume was mounted with write access, and to please rerun with the -I parameter. Now, I'm anticipating Apple will fix this. This just looks like an oversight. But currently, as of today, if you do a safe boot on Catalina, it'll go really quick because it's only checking the read-only system volume, so you're not going to have your APFS snapshots there. Couple more things. Safe boot mode may restart the Mac if it fixes directory problems. Now, this is something I'm unsure of, because I've used safe boot mode many times over the years to fix directory problems, and I've never once seen it reboot a Mac. But Apple's most recent support article on safe boot, so if you do a Google search on safe boot Apple and look at their most recent support article, it says, if the directory is repaired, the Mac automatically restarts. And like I've said, I've never seen this behavior, and I've also posted to the Mac admin's general Slack channel asking, has anyone seen a Mac reboot when they went into safe boot mode, and no one has seen this. You've seen it? Okay. Okay, great. Well, it could be that it's a new behavior, like starting with Mojave. And that's why maybe I've not personally seen it. But just keep in mind, if it does repair the directories, the machine may reboot. Now, this same Apple support article that says that the Mac is going to be rebooted, it also states that user-installed fonts are disabled in safe boot mode. And I used to do a lot of Mac training, and I know that was true back in the day, like Snow Leopard days. It did. But I can't reproduce it now with Mojave or Catalina. So I have several Macs in my lab, and I can tell you that when I boot any of them in safe boot mode, it runs the fonts, it loads the fonts that are in home library fonts just fine. So I don't know if Apple is talking about maybe fonts that were activated in FontBook. I'm not 100% sure on that. So this is why I didn't include user-installed fonts when I listed the things that are disabled by safe boot, because I'm not so sure about this one anymore. And beware if you have a Mac that shuts itself down while it's doing a safe boot. And what I mean by that is you hold the shift key down, you get the Apple with the progress bar, and then you're waiting, and it turns itself off. That is a warning sign that I've found, means that there are directory problems with the drive that it could not fix. Now, Apple doesn't have this documented. They have some vague documentation that says if it shuts down, contact an Apple representative. But I've seen it enough times that I can say with pretty much certainty that if your Mac shuts down in the middle of a safe boot, then it's got some problems that you're going to need to look into. But most of the time, these Macs will boot normally. So if you hit the power button, they'll come right back up. So it's hard to justify it really has a problem. And in this case, I would recommend you boot into recovery mode, run disk utility, and find out what's really wrong with the drive. Okay, and one more thing. This shift down technique that I just showed you, it has a lot in common with another technique I've been using a lot over the last couple of years, which I call my who's there technique. And both methods operate out of Connivin's complex domain, where you experimentally narrow down potential troublemakers as the cause of the problem. So I don't have time to walk you through my Who's There technique in detail, but here's an overview of it. You run the free Knock Knock app, available from objective-c.com. And this app was written by Patrick Wardle, and it's hands down the best app I've come across for reporting all the third-party items that are running in the background on a Mac. Basically anything that's started that isn't signed by Apple. And Patrick and others refer to this as persistently installed software. So after Knock Knock has completed scanning the Mac, everything it reports should be considered a potential troublemaker, because these are all third-party items that have been added to the Mac. And this, of course, includes all the things that were disabled by SafeBoot, like third-party kernel extensions and launch daemons and launch agents. But Knock Knock takes this further by scanning additional directories where potential persistent software has known to be sometimes installed. Knock Knock even pulls the MD5 hash from everything in its report, and it looks for matches in the virus total database. So not only is Knock Knock great at showing you all the third-party processes running in the background, if any of them are malware, they will almost certainly be identified as such. And if this sort of thing floats your boat, check out Patrick Wardle's beta app called Block, which takes Knock Knock one step further by actively looking for new persistently installed software and blocking them with an alert. So this is Knock Knock, but Block takes it one step further. Again, another free app on Objective-C's site. So if you're troubleshooting a problem within Connivin's complex domain and you think the cause may be from a third-party item that somehow got installed or migrated over the years, go through Knock Knock's scan results and temporarily remove anything that doesn't look normal for the Macs you support. The Knock Knock report includes the full path to whatever is causing the software to run in its report. So it's just a matter of temporarily removing these items, either one at a time or in bulk, rebooting, and see if the problem goes away. If the problem doesn't go away, you can put them back if you feel they're legitimate, because oftentimes you have a lot of bloat on your Macs that don't need to be there, and then try the next one and reboot. I've used this safe-to-fail experiment dozens of times to troubleshoot really obscure Mac problems, ranging from legit malware to crazy old system components that have been carried over year after year after year by migration assistant. So this is the Connivin Framework, and I encourage you all to print out a copy of this grid, post it somewhere at work, and while you're troubleshooting problems, make it a point to ask yourself questions like, what domain am I using? Why did I slot the problem in this domain? And am I in this domain because it's where I feel most comfortable, or is this problem better suited for another domain? That concludes my presentation. If you're interested in learning more about Connivin, be sure to check out Dave Snowden's website, cognitive-edge.com. I'm leading the discussion group on Mac troubleshooting later today, so if you're stuck with figuring something out, that'd be a good time to talk it over. I'd also be very willing to share my experiences with Scrum if anyone wants to learn more about that. Shameless plug, my company's looking for a couple of experienced Mac engineers, so if you're looking for job opportunities, talk to me. Of course, you can email me with any questions. Every attendees from this conference and other conferences I speak at send me emails afterwards, and I like the exchange, or better yet, just track me down here at the conference. I'm all ears. Do you have a question? Okay.
I was just going to say we typically do our FSDK from single user mode.
Okay.
Because it kind of gives you a rundown of everything that it's looking through and gives you the whole readout or whatever. I didn't realize safe mode did that automatically, but does it make any difference Are both of them just as thorough with the FTP?
No, although I honestly have not tested single user mode out extensively with Catalina. I know it functions, but I don't know the ins and outs of any gotchas or glitches. A lot of the stuff I teach is I try to dumb it down or make it simple. And not that you guys need it, but this is just the style that I use when I train other Mac engineers on how to troubleshoot stuff. So single user mode and manually running FSCK is very valid. But it will take just as long as doing a safe boot. I tested that in my hotel room last night. Even doing a live verification on your drive, launching the disk utility while the Mac OS is running and click the verify disk. It took 5 minutes on my machine because I have, I think, 6 or 7 local APFS snapshots. But good question, it's still a valid thing.
We had a lot of computers that when they upgraded to Mojave, they would have problems with the startup. And I think it's because people were interrupting the install, like we were talking about people shutting down. But we would find in single user mode that it would list all these errors for too many corpses being created or something like that. It required a reinstallation of the operating system, but it was something we would have only seen in single user mode.
Totally seen that before. When it does the APFS conversion, if it was on HFS before, when you go to Mojave, it takes a long time. Users get frustrated with it. It reboots a couple times. They think that something's wrong, so they shut the machine down, and then it closes the operating system and throws a bunch of errors that you saw, and it requires a reinstallation. So, yeah, I can confirm that's a behavior I've seen.
Yeah, I had a question about Macs that are binded to directory services. We noticed when people are logging in for the first time, there's about 6 folders tied to the profile that aren't building. It's getting a 0 KB, especially a keychain. It's a keychain folder as well. It's like keychain, mail, and some of the other general ones. Have you ever seen anything similar to that? I do know a workaround, but it's
I haven't seen the 0K folders, but I suspect I know the cause of them. So I write the standards and best practices for my company, and I have a doc on our standard for how to join a Mac to Active Directory, which I recently updated that says, don't encourage our customers to do this. So we've kind of gone past this, and now we're in the world of casual binding, where we use things like Enterprise Connect or Jamp Connect or what's the other one? What's the free version? Nomad. But in my previous doc, I have these 30 pages on if you do all of these things, your Mac will join to Active Directory and you won't have any glitches. And they include things like setting the time server to the same time server that the domain is using. And I'd be happy to share that doc with you, because I can almost guarantee one of the many things on all those pages is a simple step that you hadn't thought of to try that ultimately would prevent that from happening. So come see me at the troubleshooting session later today, and I'll show you that doc. You can scan through it real quick.
Thank you. Anybody else? Questions? All right, everybody, please, a big, warm thank you for...
Thank you, everybody.